Chapter 12. The Unfriendly You. "I wonder if the car belongs to the Reinhardts, or if they stole that too," said Jean, who was seated next to her sister in the back of the Jeep. "I'd certainly like to find out," said Louise. "Where do you suppose they're going?" she asked, watching the road ahead carefully. "I wish I knew." Jean frowned. "I'm mad at myself for not getting the license number. Did you get it?" Louise shook her head. "No, isn't that awful? Everything happened so fast. The car was too far away before I realized who was in it." The road twisted and turned, past occasional patches of woods. At some points, it was hugged by buttes and canyons. At last, Mrs. Strong reached a long open stretch. The Reinhardt's car had vanished. "What luck," Jean said in disappointment. "Where could they have gone?" "Actually, there are many hiding places off this road," said Mrs. Strong. "It's my guess the Reinhardts knew we were after them and pulled in among some trees or followed the curve of a canyon until their car was out of sight." The Danas were dismayed to have had their quarry in plain view, only to lose track of the couple altogether. Mrs. Strong, surprisingly, began to laugh. "Forgive me, please," she said. "I'm sorry we didn't capture those people, but I just got to thinking. This is the most excitement I've had in years." Aunt Harriet sighed. "I'm glad you're enjoying it. If I had my way, I'd like a little slower pace on such a rough road." Louise and Jean looked at each other. Did they dare suggest that the group make a search of the woods and canyon? Before the girls had a chance to bring up the subject, Mrs. Strong said, "I wish I could continue the search for the Reinhardts, but I really must get home in time for the evening chores and to feed my animals. You know, it's bad luck to leave a pet that depends on you. He may turn on you when you do show up. I suppose it's because of his being too hungry." The Danas did not comment. Mrs. Strong was truly a contradiction, they thought. She was brave and seemed willing to undertake any difficult task to help others, yet she was certainly influenced by her superstitions. As they rode along, this time at a more comfortable rate of speed, the ranch woman said she would stop in Rawhide to report seeing the Reinhardts. When they reached the town, she asked the girls to go into the general store and telephone Deputy Sheriff Alt from there. The sisters hopped out of the Jeep and went inside. Caleb Winthrop said he would be happy to have them use his telephone. Louise gave the deputy a full report and was assured his men would be alerted. It was late afternoon when the travelers reached the ranch. Mr. Strong met them as they pulled up to the house. He wore a broad grin. "Well, folks," he said, "I trust you had a successful trip?" When Louise and Jean told the story of their recent adventures, he whistled in amazement. Then, with a chuckle, he asked, "Do you girls ever spend a quiet day?" "Not when we're trying to solve a couple of mysteries at once," Jean replied, grinning. The rancher announced he had news of his own. "It may be very good, too," he said. "One of my herders who arrived a little while ago from our farthest fence says he saw a dog that fits Barron's description." "Oh, how marvelous!" Louise cried out. "Where?" "I'll show you on a map I have of the ranch," Mr. Strong offered, and went on. "The dog wouldn't come near my man, even though he called him by name. That could mean, of course, that it wasn't Barron, but another German shepherd. I have a hunch, though, it was Barron, because during the time I've lived here, I've never heard of anyone around owning a German shepherd." "Would it be possible for us to go out there and look around?" Jean asked hopefully. "Why, sure thing," Mr. Strong replied. "Let's talk about it at supper. Right now, there's a lot of work to do and it's getting late." Remembering what Mrs. Strong had said about feeding her pets, Louise and Jean offered to do this. The ranch woman accepted, but added laughingly, "First I'll go speak to each one. They expect it." After she had done so, Mrs. Strong went into the house to prepare supper. Meanwhile, the girls fed the chickens and collected the eggs. Next, they brought food to the dog Eleanor, to the fawn, which arrived for his evening meal, the eagle with the broken wing, and the lazy old tomcat. "They don't seem to mind who feeds them," Jean said with a giggle, "as long as they eat." As soon as supper was finished and the dishes had been washed, Mr. Strong spread his map out on the dining room table. "I had no idea your ranch was so large," Aunt Harriet commented, and Jean asked, "Do you have sheep over the entire place?" "Oh, no," Mr. Strong answered. "We give the grazing lands a rest and move the sheep to new fields." He put his finger on a spot at the rim of the ranch. "Here's where the herder saw the dog he thought might be Baron." "How far is that from here?" Louise asked eagerly. Mr. Strong smiled. "As a matter of fact, it's on the way to Lost Lake." "It is!" Jean exclaimed. "Then Baron could have been held by the witch and escaped." "I don't know whether this is a good or bad clue," Louise said. "If Baron isn't at Lost Lake, there's no telling what direction he may have taken." "Just the same," Jean declared, "I'd like to hunt for him from the spot where he was seen." "Oh, I would too," Louise assured her sister. Mr. Strong looked at Aunt Harriet, then at the girls. "I've arranged my work so that day after tomorrow, Monday, I can inspect the sheep in that section. I want to select the ones that are ready for market. Would you girls like to go there with me, and after I've finished, continue on to Lost Lake?" The sisters were thrilled. But Louise asked, "Won't you have to bring the sheep back to send them to market?" "My boys will drive them in," he said cheerfully. "Don't worry, we'll go on to Lost Lake." "Wonderful!" Jean's face glowed. Mr. Strong chuckled. "I guess Mom here and your Aunt Harriet will be glad to have us out of the way for a while. It'll give 'em a chance to finish that hooked rug." Early the following morning, the girls were awakened by the whinnying of a horse. They leaped up and peered from their window. "It's Jubilee!" Jean cried. "She's back! She broke loose from those awful Reinhardts." Or maybe they got scared and let her loose, Louise guessed. Anyway, she's home. "Hi, Jubilee," Jean called, poking her head out the window. "I'll be right down." The girls pulled on Levi's, coats, and boots, then rushed outdoors. Jean hugged the lovable saddle horse, while Louise patted her affectionately. As they were leading the mare to the barn, Mr. Strong came from the ranch house. "Well, I'll be sheep-dyed," he exclaimed. "Where did you come from?" Jubilee nuzzled her owner, who went with the girls to the horse's stall. Ginger gave a low whinny of welcome to her stablemate. Jean said exuberantly, "Now I'll have my own horse to ride tomorrow." That evening, the girls packed the food, water containers, and beverages for the trip and went to bed early. The first one ready the next day was Eleanor. From past experience, the dog knew when preparations were underway to round up sheep for market, and she would have a big part in this operation. "Eleanor is one of my best herders," said Mr. Strong as the riders gathered after breakfast with their own mounts and a pack horse. "Those sheep will pay attention to her when we men are having a hard time with them." Louise went to speak to the sheepdog. "Eleanor, if you're that smart, how about finding Baron for us?" The dog wagged her tail vigorously and whined softly, as if agreeing to undertake the task. "Mount up," the rancher called. The girls swung on to Ginger and Jubilee, waved gaily to Aunt Harriet and Mrs. Strong, then rode off with the rancher. The way led over rolling country, almost free of buttes and canyons. They made excellent time, and by mid-morning could see a great flock of sheep ahead. Each animal had a green circle painted just above its stumpy tail to indicate the sheep belonged to the Strong ranch. "Goodness," said Jean. "I had no idea you raised so many." Mr. Strong grinned boyishly. "We send a couple of thousand to market every year. I dare say some of the lamb may have reached your own hometown butcher shops." As they drew closer, the girls could see several sheep herders riding horses among the animals. Mr. Strong leaned down from his saddle and said to Eleanor, "Go get Juan." Without hesitation, the dog bounded off and a few minutes later brought back Juan DeCito. The Mexican foreman said good morning to the group, then added, "Senor Strong, how many sheep you want for market?" "I have an order for 250, the rancher replied. "A carload." Juan grinned broadly, his tiny mustache stretching out almost to twice its length. "That will be an easy job." Mr. Strong and the girls dismounted, but the rancher suggested that Louise and Jean stay where they were and watch. "Come on, Eleanor." The two men and the dog walked among the flock, and work began. With practiced eyes, Mr. Strong selected the sheep he wanted. As soon as he had made his choice, Juan or one of the other sheep herders painted a red circle on its rump. "This is really an interesting sight, isn't it?" Louise remarked as she looked at the sheep, some standing still, some walking about slowly and munching the partly dried grass. Jean giggled. "They look better from a distance. Close up, they're pretty dirty. No white woolly lambs here." "I suppose all the animals that go to market will be sheared," said Louise, "and meet their doom without their fur coats." Jean did not reply with one of her usual quips. She had strolled over to a young ewe standing protectively near a lamb, probably one of her own. "Aren't they cute?" Jean called to her sister. She leaned down and pulled up a handful of grass. Walking forward, she held out her hand toward the animals. The pair came up to her, and the ewe grabbed at the grass. Jean, thinking that the mother sheep was gentle, began to stroke the young lamb. Instantly, the ewe gave the girl a gentle butt. Jean laughed and tried again to pet the lamb. This time, the ewe lowered her head, shoving the girl aside. "What's the big idea?" Jean said, giggling. "So you want to play games? How about a ride?" She climbed astride the ewe's back. Instantly, the animal started to run. Jean pulled up her knees, sank her hands deep into the woolly back, and hung on tightly. "Whoa! Stop!" she commanded. "I'll get off." From a distance, Mr. Strong and Juan heard Jean cry out and turned to look. The sight of the ewe gamboling about with Jean riding on her back caused them to roar with laughter. Louise, too, was enjoying the show, but a moment later her smile froze into a look of fright. The ewe's hind legs had gone up high, and Jean went sailing through the air. She landed with a thud on the grass. Louise rushed up to her sister, who lay dazed for a moment. Then she sat up, smiling ruefully. "I'm all right," Jean said. "I guess it served me right." By this time, Mr. Strong and Juan had run over. As Jean rose to her feet, the rancher asked how she felt. Jean managed a smile. "As if I'd been put in my place," she replied. "The strong sheep sure are strong." "They're not used to human playmates," said Mr. Strong. Chuckling, he and Juan went off to continue the selecting of sheep. The girls waited patiently at the fringe of the flock. Finally, the rancher joined them, saying his work was complete. The riders mounted, and he led the way around the edge of the grazing ground. Presently, they came to a woods. All this time, Eleanor had been following them. Now Mr. Strong reined up and looked at her. "You want to go along, don't you, old girl?" he asked. At that moment, the dog suddenly pricked up her ears. Then she growled, and like a shot was off into the woods. "She must have heard some animal," Mr. Strong explained. "You mean one that's an enemy to sheep?" Jean asked. "Yes, perhaps a mountain lion." Suddenly, Louise had another idea. She asked excitedly, "Do you suppose it could be Baron?" She jumped from her horse and ran into the woods after Eleanor. End of chapter 12.